unifying language, we agreed on themes for collective action towards sustainable food systems. We use language to balance our long-term narrative change and plant-based transitions away from animal agriculture with the reform work and immediate interventions that might resonate more with people and organizations outside the animal rights movement. So we ensure that our long-term vision and vision always serve as the broader canvas, even as we highlight those aspects of our work that resonate with our target audience in order to build trust and credibility with multiple stakeholders. We use language that prioritizes the needs of our audience, even as we drive tangible outcomes for animals everywhere. For example, in our diet change campaign called Food and You 2.0, our partners active in environment, biodiversity, and community engagement today are talking about how animal agriculture is the leading cause of climate change, how adopting plant-based diets can help achieve individual wellness goals, kindness towards animals, and justice for all animals, people, and the planet. This helps them prioritize their core areas, even as they focus on animal agriculture and plant-based consumption. We optimize language by highlighting those aspects of our work that resonate the most with our target audiences, so they readily receive and accept our messaging. We also encourage our partners to use the regional language of their choice as per local community preferences. In using language and culture as tools for effective local advocacy, we focus on building relationships. Sorry, just give me a second, trying to move to the next screen. Yeah. So in using language and culture as tools for effective local advocacy, we focus on building relationships with local communities, involving local grassroots organizations through every step of program design and implementation, including incorporating their feedback. The success of our programs and interventions are truly the result of these partnerships and coalitions we are building. We understand the importance of local support and ownership of our campaigns, and we have seen repeated success of this model in diverse communities and geographies. Whether, for example, the example I gave of the One Health training that we recently did, the stakeholder engagement we did in Andhra Pradesh, or our Food and You 2.0 plant-based diet change campaign in Jharkhand, Tripura, and Manipur, which are really in the east and northeast parts of India. And those familiar with India will know that India has a diverse range of cultures and languages across the different states and union territories in our country. So the key is also to accept that using language and culture for effective animal advocacy takes time. It takes time to prep, to implement, and also to establish trust and credibility. It is definitely a long-term process. Now, let me summarize these strategies that I've covered so far by reiterating that careful consideration of language and culture has influenced the ways in which we have interacted and advocated with multiple audiences in our intersectional work, both within the animal movement and outside. Depending on the audience, we have strategized how we express and communicate. We are mindful of our target audiences' cultural sensitivities and their language and cultural identities. And not just communication, we also use these tools to shape their very experience by incorporating it in the design of our interventions. For example, our policy and research language focuses on the use of technical language and frameworks with academic and professional forums to build trust and credibility, whereas our diet change interventions are tailored for individual personal appeals using simple language for awareness and education. Additionally, we are also sensitive to the cultural and local context in which we operate, relying on our local partners to help guide the execution of our campaigns and, like I said, incorporate their feedback in every possible way. Let me now talk about successes and missed opportunities as far as our Asian cultural ethos is concerned, especially in the animal rights movement, with specifically two examples. The first being a successful one through our own narrative on interconnectedness that we've used extensively, and which is deeply rooted in Eastern philosophy and culture. Whereas we think, and at least, I think that we have not been as successful with the concept of ahimsa and nonviolence as we should have in the contemporary animal rights movement in India and across Asia. Our experience tells us that the post-pandemic world values the language of interconnections. Every organization we spoke to has agreed that looking at issues from a systems-based, holistic, 360-degree approach is the way forward. This was the key to us being able to onboard 34 partners with different agendas, most of them outside the animal movement. And we believe this is also because of our Eastern thought and philosophical values that are rooted in harmony, collective well-being, and connectedness. This has certainly worked in our favor at Samayu. We've been able to build on the narrative of interconnectedness as a cultural value that has helped unite diverse motives and thinking, and our focus has always been to drive animal interests. But there is one area that we believe the animal movement has not leveraged as much as it should have. Compassion and the concept of ahimsa or non-violence are largely untapped for animal movements in India and across Asia. While some religious groups centered on ahimsa have done work in animal welfare, for example, in establishing gaushalas or cow shelters in India, the massive exploitation of cows and buffaloes in the organized and unorganized dairy industry continues in India. The contemporary animal movement has certainly not been as effective as civil society movements in using non-violence and ahimsa to drive the personal, social, and political transformation required for farm animals advocacy today. Two examples stand out from India. So Mahatma Gandhi's deep commitment to ahimsa and his moral and spiritual awakening he associated with it is one of the best examples we could cite from India. Another example is the Chipko movement in the 1970s, where women in villages hugged trees. So women in villages in a hilly region in India were hugging trees and formed human chains to protest against deforestation. This act of hugging trees to physically protect them from being cut down became a powerful symbol of nonviolent resistance. There are also powerful lessons from this movement in how it centered on the protection of forest-based livelihoods of local communities. The movement emphasized that preserving forests was not only essential for ecological balance, but also crucial for the well-being and survival of people. This is where I think the animal rights movement can learn a lot. For example, in Asia, in many regions, the reliance on traditional industries like farming, fishing, animal-based tourism may make it challenging to shift towards more compassionate practices. Economic considerations, livelihoods, availability of alternative income sources are crucial factors that we have to address in order to promote sustainable and ethical alternatives for farm animal advocacy. We may face resistance from individuals and communities who perceive changes as a threat to their cultural identity or economic livelihoods. And overcoming this resistance requires empathy, understanding, and ongoing dialogue to bridge the gap between cultural traditions and our evolving perspectives on human rights. And finally, there's a lot more to be done to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in the animal advocacy movement in Asia. Language and culture can be powerful tools to champion DEI principles. By doing so, we can create a more inclusive and equitable movement. Understanding how different forms of oppression intersect will lead to more inclusive and targeted advocacy strategies because we have to take into account the interconnected nature of gender, race, class, and other social identities to be more comprehensive and effective as animal advocates. It requires a commitment, by intentionally leveraging language and culture to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. We think that animal advocacy movements become more inclusive, they become more relevant, and they become effective. However, it does require a commitment to ongoing learning, active engagement with diverse communities, and the willingness to adopt strategies to meet the needs and aspirations of a diverse range of individuals. And with that, I will close my talk. Thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts and experiences on this really crucial, important topic for effective animal advocacy. And over to you, Sarita. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Manisha. It's always very nice to hear you. So thank you once again. Now I introduce our second speaker, Wong E. Lin. Wong E. Lin is a lawyer by profession and has been volunteering with SPCA Sri Lanka since 1996. She was the advocacy manager and farm animal welfare program manager with SPCA Sri Lanka from 2019 to 2022. She is currently the country manager for Mercy for Animals in Malaysia. Elin, I welcome you and I hand it out to you.
Thank you very much, Sarita, and thank you, Manisha, for your very illuminating presentation. Can we have someone run my slides, please?
Yes, okay. Just one moment.
Right. All right, my presentation is on language and culture as tools for more effective animal advocacy in Southeast Asia. And I picked Southeast Asia because culturally we are quite similar in many respects in most of the countries. And this is based on my 4 years of experience doing farmed animal welfare advocacy work in Malaysia, and also collaborating with colleagues in the rest of Southeast Asia as part of the Open Wing Alliance. Next slide. All right, in May of this year, volunteers with the PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, held a zombie protest to promote veganism in front of the Petronas Twin Towers in Kuala Lumpur. Now, even though this was visually very captivating and it garnered a lot of media attention, the response on social media and on other forums, including newspapers, was overwhelmingly negative. Even those who claim to be vegetarian or who support vegetarianism and better animal welfare standards condemn the protests. They say things like, oh, I support vegetarianism, but I don't think this is a good protest. You don't attack members of the public this way. This is not our way of doing things. This is not our way of life. So what then is the Southeast Asian way of doing things? Are we forever condemned to just play the role of good cop and never play the role of bad cop? So next slide. Okay, most Asian societies are described as being collectivist in nature. For the purposes of our work, what we understand this to mean is that we value public order and group harmony and social harmony more than self-expression and individual rights and preferences. So it's very social emphasized. It views people as a group rather than individuals. It discourages self-expression, and it emphasizes peace, order, and harmony. Someone seen to be rocking the boat is likely to be accused of being selfish and attention-seeking or troublemaker. Asian societies also tend to be more feudal and hierarchical, and most people are quite happy to maintain such hierarchies. You will see a lot of support for the monarchy and for aristocracy and inherited privilege in much of Southeast Asia. Next. Okay, so animal advocacy in collectivist societies. So many of you will know this vegan activist, Tobias Leonard. He recommends focusing on the how to shop for, prepare, and serve plant-based foods rather than the why. Because when you move into ethical questions, a lot of people feel attacked, and then they are stuck in a long argument about whether it's ethical, whether veganism is the most ethical diet there is, and there'll be no end to it. So we'll focus on the how. And we empathize with omnivores and we encourage meat reduction. If you offer people the choice of all or nothing, they'll go for nothing. And what Tobias recommends works in Southeast Asia and in more collectivist societies too. So Asians generally try to avoid confrontation. They avoid extreme measures, though I think killing animals for food is more is a greater sign of extremism than abstaining from eating animal products. And they don't like standing out in a crowd. They don't like 180-degree turns. When we conducted sessions for students and we asked them if they've ever tried to go vegetarian, they say, I would like to, but my mom cooks for the family, and if I don't eat what she cooks, it will hurt her feelings. So hurting a family member's feelings to them is a bigger offense, is a more serious offense than consuming animal products. So next. So what are some of the linguistic nuances we can utilize when doing advocacy with members of the public, even things like press releases and letters to the editor and letters to corporations and government departments? So What are some of the linguistic nuances we can utilize? First, I would say, suggest that something is a growing trend. Everyone's doing it because Asians like to be doing whatever everyone else is doing. You don't want to stand up too much in a crowd. You don't want to appear to be arrogant or showing off. Suggest that something is the responsible and pro-social thing to do. We like to show that we are responsible, we are considerate, that we are good functioning members of a society. So we tell them it's the pro-social thing to do. And we suggest that other countries, states, societies, and corporations have already made a particular commitment or transition, and that we should follow suit, that they've already done it, why don't you? That means it's possible. Someone else has done it. It's not something so novel and so new and so outrageous that it's not been done. And if there's a friendly rivalry between countries, for example, between Malaysia and Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, you can suggest that a neighboring country has already adopted a particular measure and that we don't want to be left behind. For example, Singapore is leading the way when it comes to cell-cultured meat, and it's already ready for market. And we thought that, oh, it's going to take decades before Malaysia reaches that point because we are a Muslim majority country. There's less emphasis on producing slaughter-free meat. But then recently, just this year, there's a news report that a Malaysian biotech company called Cell Agritech has commenced producing cell-cultured meat in Malaysia, and they've already signed a joint venture agreement with Umami Meats of Singapore. So this is one of the ways in which we can rely on the friendly rivalry between countries to push each country to do better. Next. All right, so how do we capitalize on racial and religious sentiments without causing a great big war or conflict between different faith groups and different ethnic groups? Religion is often seen as a barrier to the promotion of better animal welfare and rights. Most religions are anthropocentric, that means human-centered. I would also say that it's patriarchal. And they reinforce the idea of human dominance. Humans at the very top, everyone else is put on earth for our use, for our consumption. Trying to fight this by ridiculing or arguing with religious officials and clergy will most likely result in a backlash. It may cause a loss of support for our cause. People might say, oh, you're insulting my religion and this is just not done. And it may result in resistance to our ideas and campaigns from those who consider themselves religious. They might say, oh, my religion says this is the best practice there is, this is the safest and healthiest way of procuring food. Who are you to tell me that my religion is wrong? Next slide. Okay, so instead of arguing with religious officials, appeal to the better angels of our nature. You use language to show like we can do better than this. Your religion has a history of showing kindness to animals, to having very high standards of welfare. So promote stewardship of the environment and the protection of animals as a higher religious calling, an act of faith or an act of religious and community service. For some of us, we may disagree with this because we feel that, oh, this is so patronizing, this is so condescending. I believe in equity and environmental justice and justice for animals. I don't believe in stewardship. But we are working with a very different audience here, people who don't even believe that animals have the right to life. They view animals as property. So we have to talk to them using terms that will appeal to them, appeal to their sense of ethics, their sense of responsibility, their sense of stewardship. And we point out how a plant-based diet meets all the requirements of the particular religion as a responsible, ethical, healthy, and purifying diet. So if you're going to give up something for Lent, try going vegan for Lent. If you're giving up something for Diwali, we'll say that serve a plant-based meal this Diwali, right? Then people won't consider you stingy or not generous if you don't do that. Do that as an ethical decision. Next slide. and tell stories from the history of the particular nation, race, and religion to show that kindness to animals is part of its history, that we have had a long history of showing compassion, of showing loving kindness. Identify religious leaders who are vegetarian or vegan. Even celebrities and key opinion leaders such as social media influencers will do. Engage the assistance and support of activists and advocates who profess that particular religion or belong to the target race. So I normally recommend reaching out to professionals such as doctors, nutritionists, veterinarians, because people tend to view them as credible. Asians value academic qualifications a lot. So they think, oh, if you're professional and you have the academic qualifications to back you up and you're vegan and you're not dead yet, I think we can believe you. I think we can trust you. Right, so next slide. And appeal to tradition and a simpler, better way of life. When you talk to people in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Thailand, many of them believe that their parents and grandparents had a better quality of life. They may not be as affluent, but they had more freedom. They spent time outdoors. They ate whole foods. They moved their bodies more. They are less likely to have lifestyle-related diseases. So use statistics to show how much meat consumption has increased. Let people tell their stories too. Like my parents' generation ate chicken twice a year, on Chinese New Year and winter solstice. They didn't get chicken or any other meat for the rest of the year. My generation would get KFC and McDonald's if you did really well in your school examinations, or if it's your birthday. You don't get fast food the rest of the time. But then the current generation, Gen Z, pretty much consumes fast food and processed foods every day, not merely as a treat. So we can use this kind of comparisons to get people to tell their stories too, because it will show a desire for them to eat healthier, to eat less processed foods. Then that's how you get them to start agreeing with you. Yes, we need to reduce, right? So highlight the increase in fast food restaurants, obesity, lifestyle diseases, and environmental degradation caused by animal agriculture. Next slide. So provide evidence that your nation or ethnic group's traditional diet was largely plant-based, that most people ate meat only during festivals and celebrations and weddings. Otherwise, the cow grazes peacefully in the backyard for the best part of its life. So, and promote traditional foods such as tofu and tempeh, not highly processed or expensive alternative proteins. A lot of people would say that, oh, I'd go vegan only, it's so expensive. Why is vegan food so expensive? I can point out that most traditional foods in Malaysia consist of fresh vegetables that are locally sourced and locally grown. So it's not necessarily expensive if you don't purchase highly processed food products. Provide how-tos. Just as Tobias recommends, instead of getting into an argument about the ethics of veganism, just provide ways to shop for, prepare, and serve traditional plant-based foods, and ways to veganize traditional cuisine and dishes. So this is Chef Dave, Kali Dev Murgaya, I think. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a vegan chef in Malaysia. He only went vegan about 4 to 5 years ago. Previously, he was a chef on Disney cruises. And of course, they had to downsize because of the pandemic, and he was back on land, and he became a vegan chef and grew a huge following on social media. Now he conducts classes, like highly subsidized classes, cooking classes for low-income families. And most of his audience is not vegan. They are mostly Malaysian homemakers and mothers who want to encourage their children to eat more vegetables, and they don't know how to prepare plant-based meals that are affordable. So this is one way we can reach out to people to say, this is affordable, this is nutritious, this is as nutritious as a meat-based meal, this is the calorie and nutritional information that you need. Right, next. How do we build allies with corporations if we can't play the bad cop at all? Most country and regional managers of food corporations in Asia are not very different from the general public, especially if they are local hires. They dislike confrontation too. So awareness of farmed animal welfare and environmental issues in Asia may be low, because what we know in, say, Jakarta, Bangkok, and Kuala Lumpur and Singapore City may not be a reflection of what the rest of the country, the more rural population, knows. So even if we are aware of cell-cultured meat, of vegan products, alternative proteins, this may be not what people in small towns and rural areas are aware of. So how this translates to our corporate advocacy is that when we tell corporations, this is what the consumer wants, they can call our bluff on it. Most of the time, they know that this is not true, that there's no such demand outside of the capital city, that the population of environmental and vegan activists is very small. And they can look at our petitions and say, well, you have a population of how many million, yet there are only 1,000 signatures, and 600 of these signatures are from the US and EU. So we're calling your bluff on it. Next slide. So here are alternative ways of communicating with corporations and campaigning when there is insufficient public support. You point out that your competitors have already made commitments and improvements. This is Jacinta and me when we were with SPCA Selangor. So we were telling McDonald's that their competitors, namely Subway and KFC, have already agreed to use cage-free eggs and they are lagging behind. We point out that their counterparts in the European Union and North America have already made commitments. So basically we're telling them it can be done. So make your commitment global. And we point out that Asian consumers should not be left out. Why do we have to settle for a lower standard, animal welfare standard? We shouldn't have to settle. We shouldn't be second best. We want higher welfare too. And we offer to assist with sourcing and certification processes. We tell them we'll put them in touch with Humane Farm Animal Care. We'll get the experts in to talk to them. We'll have discussions with their procurement and suppliers. And tell them that, well, it's only been done by the last 3 other food franchise companies. So if you sign on to this commitment, you will be ahead of the competition. And we tell them that it's a growing movement, and sooner or later, this is going to be the global standard. So you might as well sign on to it now and have time to adjust and have time to transition and get it done sooner than later. If you sign on now, it'll make you look like you're ahead of the competition. This might not get you an immediate response. They might not respond with an immediate commitment, but it's more likely to keep the channels of communication open, and it's far less likely to burn bridges. So far, we've not had a single company write to us and say, please don't contact us again, we are going to block you from now on. So we get a foot in the door, even if we can't get a commitment. So when do you play the role of bad cop? You play the role of bad cop when you are sure you have wide public support, and possibly when you have governmental support, for example, from the Ministry of Health or Ministry of Agriculture, or when you have evidence, you have a trump card such as investigations and reports and photographs and footages of what goes on in their suppliers' farms. When you don't have that, when you're just reaching out to them to talk to them, you have to play the good cop for some time. All right, next. Government lobbying. Remember that because most Asian societies are collectivist, they are more likely to affirm and reinforce strong hierarchies. And the support for the monarchy and the clergy can be very strong. There are lèse majesty laws in countries like Thailand, Brunei, and Malaysia. And this means that any kind of message that is interpreted to be critical of the monarchy, of royalty, can result in criminal action against you. So avoid casting aspersions on royalty and members of the royal family's links to agribusinesses, food companies, and government agencies. If you know this is the agency that's supplying, say, eggs to a particular major company, just name the company. Don't start pointing out that, oh, you know, this is the crown prince of this, one of the directors is the crown prince of this particular state, and this is really unfair because you rich folks do whatever you like it to harm the average citizen. Don't point out things like that. That can be really risky, and your organization may lose public support and credibility. Just point out what corporations and government departments can do to improve farm animal welfare standards, promote a healthier and plant-based lifestyle, and protect the environment. Point out to avoid a defamation suit or lèse majesté suit, just point out whatever is factual information that is publicly available and verifiable, because when something is factual, it's a complete defense in a defamation suit. Next. So be aware of defamation and sedition laws in each country. So the standards may be quite different in each country. So if you are, let's say, trying to campaign against a particular company to try to get them to go cage free, you cannot use footages that are from general stock photos or footages from different farms, because they'll come back to you and say, aha, we're going to sue you for libel because this is not our farm. This footage did not come from a farm. You can't prove that it did. So don't pit racial and religious groups against one another. For example, by alleging that a particular group is cruel and another group is kinder or superior or more advanced. As a young movement in the region, we need to make allies, and we cannot afford to antagonize government departments and officials or the monarchy. You don't do that until you're very powerful and you have a lot of support, like MFA and PETA and HSI in the US. Sometimes, in order to get things done, we may need to let the corporation or government agency take the credit for the improvements and changes we have recommended. If they want to claim that, oh, we've come up with this comprehensive animal welfare policy, even though it's actually the result of meetings and discussions with 5 different NGOs, let them take the credit, because the end result is that more animals live better lives and fewer animals are killed, hopefully. So saving face is an important part of Asian culture. I think this applies in East Asia as well as Southeast Asia. So helping a governmental agency save face may be necessary if it helps us win the bigger fight against cruelty to animals. So if they want to downplay our role, they want to they don't want to disclose that it's a result of campaigning, months of campaigning and protests and memorandum, handing over of memoranda, and they want to claim that it's entirely their idea, their own initiative. Sometimes you just have to let them do that. Keep your eye on the goal. You can't advocate for animals if you're arrested or if your organization is deregistered. So next. And so keep up the good work and have each other's backs. Sometimes it may feel like we are Davids fighting a Goliath, but ultimately Goliaths can get taken down too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eden. That was terrific. I think we could make a guidebook out of it for how to do your advocacy better at local levels. So we have a couple of questions, and maybe Manisha, you can also switch on your camera and we could take these questions with both of you. So the first question, I'll field it to Manisha. Manisha, so the question is, how does one keep a balance between respecting culture that may involve the use of animals while also advocating for animal protection?
I think the key word there is balance, right? And thanks to this fantastic presentation that Elin just made just now, she has come up with such wonderful practical suggestions and tips, for doing that. So I'm going to lean on a little bit of that as well as I answer this question. It's about understanding that culture. It's about understanding what works in that culture. It's not about importing, what you think might be a Western philosophy to handle a situation, which could be confrontation. So in our Asian cultures, like Elin has mentioned, confrontation doesn't necessarily work. And providing that balance, so people trust, establishing trust and credibility is really important. There are many ways to do that, but it depends on the audience. I also saw questions, for example, on farmers. So when you're talking to a farmer audience, you have to really be careful that you find something that is elevating animal interests, but is also something that does not threaten their livelihoods immediately. You have to get a step in the door. You can't straight away go and confront them and say, go plant-based. Obviously, they're not going to listen. So, and it's a long-term process. It has to start, at a point, but you have to understand that it'll be a slow process. It'll be a long-term process. So the example that I gave for the One Health training, everyone there, whether it was farmers, whether it was, stakeholders from the industry, everybody agreed that antibiotics as growth promoters is something that we should not do. And for us, that was an amazing, amazing consensus on something that does help the animals, also gets us a foot in the door to talk to government, to talk to the farmers. Farmers also agreed this isn't right because of the discussions that we had. We had like medical health personnel, coming and presenting there, and they spoke about how antibiotics harm our individual health. It's bad for the farmer. It's bad for everybody. It's bad for the animal. Can we find those levers? Can we build narratives in such a way that they take us to a point, which is a common point, that everyone agrees to? We then start our journey there. We build trust and credibility with those farmers. We get them to understand we are there for their well-being. Once that process is done, that's a long process, then we go ahead and start talking about how is it that you can move your way from animal agriculture to plant-based transitions. And even for that, we have to do research. We have to study their socioeconomic backgrounds. We have to do agri-research. We have to find out what works. And that's why I've said it's a long process. And yes, I totally agree with the majority of what Elin said. We cannot be confrontational in our approach.
Thank you.
Saita, does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it does. And you partly answered the other question also. So my next question is to Elin. So a lot of people argue that their traditional or cultural food is being polluted and is misleading when veganized. That is simply can't be termed as traditional or cultural food when substitutes are used. What is an effective way to respond to this?
We can point out that traditionally, people used to catch or raise their own food, especially in the village areas, and food was much healthier and animals had a better quality of life. Chickens ran free, cows plowed the fields for a large number of years before they were finally slaughtered, right? So we say that, but now animals are raised in factory farms, which are very unhealthy. They are subjected to a lot of cruelty. They are pumped full of antibiotics and growth promoters and hormones, and that it's no longer traditional. This is no longer the right way to raise animals and to produce, to recreate a traditional dish. They say if you want to go really traditional, maybe you should catch your own fish and raise your own chickens for this dish. Say that people always move with the times, and that there are always better ways of doing something, that if you were to see the way animals are raised for yourself, you might not agree that this is a traditional or optimal way of raising and producing food anymore.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That does answer the question. So my next question is to Manisha. Manisha, someone has asked this question. Do you have any examples of situations in which the culture of people you were trying to work with was very resistant to your message or your work?
Yes, we face that every day. So it is, for example, even with the partner organizations, when we initially approach them, they don't understand our messaging. They don't understand where we're going with this. And it's a continuous learning. I won't say that, we have cracked it. There are every day is a learning. You interact with somebody new in a different core area of work. With environmental organizations, it's a different, kind of discussion. With a public health organization, you have to talk differently. So it's all about molding and, managing your message. And I think the key to that is preparation. We don't go into any discussion with anybody without a lot of research and a lot of studying of where they are from, what organization they represent, which culture are they from. And that's why, that's the reason why I use survival as an example, because we do this every day. It's like ingrained into our very processes. And our policy and research team really is the drivers, the engine, for our work, because they do the studies and they come back to us. And then our partnerships team also does their research of which organization we are approaching, what they have done in the past, what would work with them. And then we focus, find that message which we think is going to resonate with them. We prioritize that part of our work which they will agree with the most. So that's how, and yes, we face this every day.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So another question is for Elin. So Elin, somebody's asked this question: how do you reach out to the youth or children who come from dairy or poultry farming families?
We ask them whether they foresee themselves continuing to do poultry farming or animal farming in the future, and if so, why? Because from my discussions with a lot of Chinese poultry farmers in Malaysia, they don't want their children to continue being poultry farmers. They've outsourced most of the work to migrant workers, migrant labor, and they want their children to work in air-conditioned offices. And they say, oh, it's hard, dirty work. You suffer a lot of losses if there's a disease outbreak. And the government makes things harder and harder for us because they keep coming up with all these guidelines about where the waste is supposed to go, where the water is supposed to go. So we talk to them, why do you want to continue? If someone doesn't express the view that they would like their children to have a job other than animal farming, poultry or livestock farming, we'll ask them, what do you like most about this job? Where do you see the industry will be in 10 years? If you could have any other job, what would it be? And generally they'll say things like, if we don't farm animals, what will people eat? Vegetables aren't enough to meet everyone's nutritional needs. You will need a lot more land. Then you back that up with scientific facts that, there's a lot more vertical farming, urban farming, etc. And then animals can be produced through in labs, cell cultured meat. There are all these new technologies coming up. So nutritional needs can be met. And we say that we understand it's been in your family a long time, but the world was very different 50 years ago. It was less densely populated. The demands weren't so high. The waste generated was lower. Now with intensive agriculture, your cost goes up too, right? There are more and more demands on you by local councils and the Ministry of Environment and so forth. So we let them we ask them for their feedback first. What do you think? What do you like most about it? Is it just the profits? Is it something else? We can't immediately rush in and tell them, oh, you can't just think about money, you must think about environment. Because in a lot of Asian culture, to them, the biggest, the most noblest thing you can do is to take care of your family. Right? To them, I need to provide for my family. That's the most important thing. If I don't provide for my family, why would I care about the environment? The planet is so big. Let everyone take care of their own families and we'll all get along just fine. Many of them will think that way. So we'll ask them first for their feedback. What do you think is so good about it? What do you like best about it? Where do you see the industry is going in 10 years? How has it changed from your father's time? So
Thank you.
pretty much
Thank you. Thank you. Very descriptive and very, very good. Got a lot of points to. We also work in the colleges, so I think I can also employ this somewhere. So Manisha, I have another question for you. Someone has asked, in your experience in working with stakeholders, do you come across microcultures? For example, the farmers, fishermen, aquaculture workers may feel like their livelihood goes back some generations in their family. Therefore, they feel part of an entitled culture and not amenable to animal welfare concepts. If so, how can you penetrate such microcultures?
I think, yes, that's very relevant to the work that we are doing right now with poultry and aquaculture farmers. We do have, I mean, these are traditional agriculturists, very likely pointed out. We have microcultures of these, but there are many different ways in which we perceive this going forward. So, we are starting with the research now. We don't have the answers yet in terms of what would work, say, for example, with a aquaculture farmer in Andhra Pradesh versus an aquaculture farmer in West Bengal versus another in Gujarat, say, for example, and it's going to be different, right? So I think that is something that we need to understand, that it takes research. There is no answer to, a sure shot answer. A particular farmer in a particular village in a particular region has a very different reality compared to another farmer. It also depends upon the kinds of farmers. Some of them are actually not working on the farms. They are these big farmers with running intensive farms. So the kind of, for example, we met with an aquaculture farmer recently in a field visit in Andhra Pradesh, where he spoke about how all his paddy fields now are converted to aquaculture farms. They don't have a single paddy field left, and he's a big farmer. When you look at who's actually handling the fish, who's actually working with the fish, it is people from the villages. It is farm workers who actually have been doing this also since ages. So there are these feudalistic structures which are also propagated, right? And like Elin said before, everybody wants to ensure that their children don't suffer at the end of the day. So that's the messaging we want to get out, that make this better for yourself, for your generations to come by surfacing the issues that are there in aquaculture. What are the issues? What are you dealing with? Building the awareness and education. And to start with that, to even get there, you can't straight away go and talk to them and say, oh, we are trying to move away from animal agriculture. You've got to start from a place where we are concerned about your health. We are here because there is an issue we see in your handling animals which are polluted or consuming them. Those kind of narratives have to be built before we get to addressing the deeply entrenched traditional mindsets and microcultures that exist. But we see a way forward. We are very hopeful that with the way that we are going, considering the first intervention that we had and many more that we are thinking of in future, we're going to learn from every one of this. We're going to incorporate the feedback, and we're going to make sure that this percolates down to every person who's engaged in the food system supply chain, not just the farmers. There are many other people who are involved, people who transport, who handle these goods, people who are selling them in the markets. I think that entire chain needs to be addressed because there are a lot of livelihoods depending on this. And a recognition and a sensitivity to that, in my opinion, is the beginning to address it.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'll close the question answer round. So thanks a lot, because this session, I think, was really, really interesting and enlightening. And I'm sure people want to connect with you. We have a couple of questions. We'll send them to you directly. So thanks once again for taking the time out. And thank you, everyone. And back to you now, Pam.
Thank you, everyone, for attending our first session. We'll resume the second sessions after 5 minutes. So good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. And welcome back to the second sessions of today's webinar called Global Trade Influences on Regional Animal Welfare in Reality. Just a brief reminder of housekeeping for anyone who has just joined us. The session is currently being live streamed on YouTube and recorded for future use as capacity building material. And all participants will be muted upon entry. We welcome any questions from the audience pertaining to the topic presented in the chat box, and we will answer them at the end. Please keep the discussion respectful and productive. I will be the moderator for this sessions. Our first scheduled speaker, Dr. Blato, cannot make it to the event due to other commitments, unfortunately. However, we're thrilled to have with us here a speaker from Eurogroup for Animal, Stephanie Gislin. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the French language, but hopefully I'm a bit closer to the mark. Please allow me first to introduce Stephanie and her work briefly. So Stephanie heads the political affairs team at Eurogroup for Animals. After leading the trade and animal welfare program for 5 years, and Eurogroup for Animals is the pan-European animal protection organizations representing more than 80 members based in the EU and beyond. Before joining Eurogroup for Animals, Stephanie worked 6 years in a consulting firm, primarily advising companies and governments on EU trade policies. And she was Eurogroup for Animals representative on the Commission's expert group on trade negotiations and has been on the EU domestic advisory groups created under the trade agreements with Ukraine, Canada, Japan, Vietnam, and Singapore. For a presentation, Stephanie will explain why working on trade policy can be useful for Asian animal protection NGOs. She will touch upon both international rules and trade agreements that are negotiated by various countries. Without further ado, I will hand over to Stephanie. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I wouldn't try to pronounce your name Prudence. You always allow me to just say Prudence, so I can't say anything. My name is Stéphanie Guillain, but don't worry, many French people would say Gislin as well. Both pronunciation exist. I hope really. So it's really a question of family, so no problem at all. I'm very pleased to be with you. I'm very happy that I wasn't late in the end. Public transportation in Belgium can be a bit hectic sometimes. So I'm going to share with you my presentation. Let me find... Do I have access? Yes. Perfect. So I hope you'll find it interesting, of course. Feel free, I would even say, to stop me in the middle of the presentation if you have any question. I really do not mind. I prefer that you interact and that you feel happy to understand everything. So just stop me if something is really not clear. I will try to make it this very abstract topic, I hope very concrete for you. So my presentation is just today about addressing animal welfare in trade policy. So at the moment I work on much more than trade, but yeah, this is my pet topic. I've always worked on this topic, and at Eurogroup for Animals, as was said, in between, we are now more than 90 members, but it's still very close to reality. We are what we call, like AfA for Animals, an umbrella organization. What we do for our members, we've been created 40 years ago when some of the big animal protection organizations in the European Union thought that there was a need to actually lobby the European Union as well. As you know, the European Union as a region is very unified, and there's a lot of regulation rules that really apply to all the countries. So those organizations decided to create together Eurogroup for Animals, and now we're more than 90. And what we do mostly is representing our members at the European level. So as Prudence said, we are usually our members representative on groups that are created by the European Commission, either to give opinion on things that are happening on legislation, or we will talk about the implementation of the trade agreements in this case. We are also campaigning together, and we are also, in a way, a hub like AfA for Animals for the organization to meet, to learn from each other, to get more synergies. So this is a bit who we are. It's a basic, but it's still very important. And I want to touch upon why do international trade rules matter to animals, and why do trade agreements matter to animals. But just to start with, in a way, it's important to understand why would we work on trade. It's very sort of abstract. What is really trade? You know, we are buying, we are selling products. So there are international rules, as I say, there are sometimes agreements between countries. Why are we really working on that? Because technically speaking, a lot of animals, even if we would want them not to be considered objects, because we see them as sentient beings that shouldn't be considered like this, they are at the moment. They are traded in many cases, but also products derived from them. So a lot of farms, for instance, produce products that are traded afterwards. And how you trade things, how much they are worth, if you are importing certain products even more or exporting them to another country, it can influence a sector. Because, for instance, the poultry, let's give an example. If you're a country, your country wants to export much more chicken, for instance, then they will maybe intensify their chicken sector. They will integrate it, verticalize it, make it even more efficient without really thinking about animals. That's not really the question. But so technically speaking, trade and the fact that we are getting values out of these animal products, it can have an impact on animals because it has an impact on the sectors and on what we call competitiveness in general. So at EU level, that's why we have started working on trade policy as soon as this big international organization was created on trade, the World Trade Organization, which was establishing rules on how you can trade internationally between the different countries. So as an organization, Your Group of Animals started working on this trade policy angle. And then we will come to that. The EU has also started negotiating with a lot of countries, among which Asian countries, what we call trade agreements. I'll come back to that, but those are agreements to facilitate the trade, the export and the imports between the different countries. Why? Because at the moment, and even back then, let's say 10 years ago already, the international rules, this organization, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, was starting not to deliver any extra results anymore. So more and more big countries like the US, the EU, started having also a bilateral trade policy, having their own trade agreement with different countries rather than discussing all together the new rules. And so us being from the European Union, having a sort of, it's not a country, but a regional entity, regulating entity, that has not always, I don't like to say that, higher standards in terms of animal welfare. It is the case often, but it's really just because, you know, elsewhere it's still very poor. It has to improve, but technically speaking, it's still higher than in many countries. We have been faced with the problem that at the moment, back then, the European Union was developing some rules on animal welfare, and those rules were only applying to the EU producers. So EU producers had to produce animal products to treat animals with higher standards. Yet, when you were importing an egg, a piece of chicken, a beef, the exporter. So for instance, when the EU banned battery cages a while ago now, it didn't apply at all to imported goods. So you could still import an egg that came from a battery cage. There was not a problem at all. And this creates, if you want, a distortion, a problem, because first, it means that the European citizens who actually wanted not to fuel this practice anymore might still be fueling it somewhere else. And why? Because often there's no labeling. There's nothing really indicating that your egg come from somewhere else, or that the product that you're buying has used eggs that come from somewhere else. And that's a big issue, because often in the EU, at least, imported eggs, to take an example, are used to make other products, or like in collective restoration, in restaurants, where you have no labeling. So this situation, at least in the EU, has led us to care also about trade. Why? Because when we were trying to improve the rules at EU level or in member states, you know, in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, we were often told, we can't do this, because if we do better for animals, if we have higher rules, the others will not do this, and then we'll have more imported goods because our products will become more expensive. And this is an argument that I will show you can debunk. It is not true. There's a lot of things to say when an authority is replying that to you. And this is the reason why your group started working on trade policy. So I will start on this aspect that I just explained, why do international rules actually matter to animals? So as I explained to you, the World Trade Organization has been created a long time ago, 94, 96. And this organization defined the rules on how you can trade products, how you can restrict the trade in certain products, what kind of labeling schemes are acceptable, etc. The idea is to ensure that let's say the competition between countries is fair and that you don't give an advantage to your own product and to your own things compared to other countries. So the idea is to keep this fairness among the members of the World Trade Organization. And why does it really matter to us? Exactly like I explained for the EU, because very often you have you campaign to ban a product. I'm taking the case of India, for instance. India has banned the import of foie gras, force-fed, fatty livers derived from force-fed animals. And so when you ban such product from the market, if you want it to be efficient, if you don't produce, like India, for instance, foie gras, you ban the import of it. You want no foie gras at all on your market. And usually when you ask for that, even if you produce the thing in question, you want maybe to ban the production, but you want no product like this on the market. So you have also to say it applies to everything, even imported goods. We don't want that on the market. And very often that's what you're looking for. Because if not, you might not get your higher standards or your ban, because the authorities will say, but if we do this and we don't apply it on all the products, even the ones that have been imported, then we are creating a lack of level playing field. We're creating an unfair competition with other countries. So as many of our campaigns aim to have better standards, to ban certain products that are too cruel, we will often face these arguments about we can't do this because of import, or we can't do this better because we can't impose those rules on import. And so this is something you will hear. This is something you need to know about. And the same thing for labeling. We are sometimes also looking at having more labels and so on. And these are also, having a label can also be felt by other countries as a sort of unfair discrimination for other partners. Like, let's say, I take any case in Japan. Japan creates a label specifically for Japanese product that the Japanese producer can get on certain standards and so on. And it's very important. And this label is actually very attractive, and consumers in Japan really look for it. And this label is not really accessible for a product from Australia or from another country. Those countries might argue that this label is unfair because they don't have access to it, and citizens Japanese consumers really like it. And so it means that it creates an unfair competition. So you see, any kind of measure can be seen as an unfair sort of barrier to trade, as we say. So that's why it matters a bit to us. Let me explain you a bit more about this weird World Trade Organization. The general idea of these rules, as I explained, is that there can't be any discrimination between the products you are importing and the one you are producing locally. And this is the term that is written here, what they call in these rules, like products. Products that are seen as similar, like an egg, can't be discriminated. You can't say, for instance, I'm treating differently the egg that is coming from Australia than the egg that I'm producing, or than the egg that is coming from Vietnam, for instance. You have to, if they're similar products, if they're like products, you have to treat them the same. And then arises the question, what is a like product? Because for us, animal activists, some people are vegan, don't eat anything at all, but maybe some are vegetarian or whatever. An egg, for instance, that doesn't come from a battery cage, a free-range egg is not the same as a cage egg for some consumers. At the moment, it's a bit unclear what you can argue is a like product or not. But for us, we wouldn't buy one for the other. Let's take an example. If you're someone who cares about that, maybe you'll go to a supermarket. And in Europe, you have labeling on eggs, for instance. And so you can see very quickly which ones are free-range, which ones are still caged. Imagine you go to the supermarket and there is no organic egg, free range, and free range egg. Do you buy them or not? Or do you go to another supermarket? If you go to another supermarket, one could argue that actually those products are not the same because you're not buying one for the other. And this is something that is discussed in what we call the case law, because the World Trade Organization has what we call a jurisprudence. There have been disputes to discuss the rules. There have been cases, there have been rulings, and in those rulings, some of the rules are better defined. And so there have been cases on like products. And one of the key things, which is very interesting, is that in that case law, not specifically on animal products, the idea of a like product was defined that is the product the same, physically speaking? Are they the same? Do they have the same end use? Are you using the product for the same purposes? More technically speaking, is that the same tariff line? Well, that's very technical. And maybe for an egg that is caged or free range, those three things are exactly the same. But then the fourth criteria that they usually talk about and put forward is what we call consumer preferences. It's exactly what I explained to you. Are the products actually competing with each other? Would one person buy one for the other? And that is somewhere where we could really argue from an animal welfare perspective. At the moment, there has been no case at the WTO where this question has been settled. But for us who are looking at this from a theoretical perspective, this is still an argument we would want to make. A caged egg, for instance, is not like a free-range egg. So this is an interesting thing. So this is just for you to understand. According to WTO rules, you can't discriminate, and discriminate means ban a product from your market or apply a higher tariff to a product or prevent them from getting a label or applying a label to them if they are the same product. The other question, which is very important, as you can see, and as I explained to you, is that there is basically no mention of animal well-being, animal protection, animal welfare in any of the text of this organization. There is no exception to respect animal welfare, or, for instance, that you can restrict trade based on animal welfare issues. There is nothing. Yet, as I explained to you, this is a set of rules where countries can start dispute among each other. So, for instance, when the EU wanted to ban the trade in seals products, so the products derived from the hunting of baby seals, Canada and Norway attacked the EU, challenged the European Union at the WTO and said they're not respecting the rule. If nobody complains, if no countries complains about your rules, nothing happens. So every rule, every measure that countries have taken all over the world are not obviously all actually WTO compatible. We don't know, because simply if no one fights them, nothing happens. So this is the first thing. But some cases, some disputes have happened, and they were about animals, animal welfare, animal well-being. And so as there is this settlement, this dispute settlement mechanism at the World Trade Organization, as I explained, there is a case law, and it can allow us to better interpret the rules. And so there are a few key cases for the WTO and for us to understand those rules. The one I've mentioned now, the EU that had been attacked on the ban on seal products. Actually, the EU won this case. Why? It was proven that the EU, according to the rules, they could restrict the trade based on one of the exceptions that was listed in the agreement. So the WTO agreements, they include a series of exceptions based on which a country is allowed to actually restrict trade. Those exceptions are related to several topics, among which, for instance, to protect animal life, animal, plant, and human life. You might think that's a good option, but that's not a very good exception for us. I can explain why if you want, if you ask me the question, because it's a bit more technical. Another exception is, for instance, to ensure the protection of animals, like in terms of conservation, I mean. And this is weirdly called something like in order to protect exhaustible resources. Bad to discuss animals, but technically in the case though, it has been proven that those exhaustible resources were to be understood to also be animals, for instance. And then there is another one, very intriguing, that is called that you can restrict trade to protect the public morals of your citizens. So basically, when your citizens have ethical concerns and they might be shocked by something, you are entitled to restrict trade to protect them. And this has, for instance, as we're in Asia, this has been used, for instance, by China on discussion like censorship and things like that. So also on completely non-animal topic. But for animals, this is the exception that the EU used to justify its ban on the trade in seized product. They explained that EU citizens were shocked by the way that baby seals were hunted. There was no way to do anything to improve this. There was no label possible to help. There was no human method of killing those seals. So the trade had to stop, like the import and the placement on the market of such product in the EU had to stop. So the EU justified this ban with the exception of public morals, as we call it. And this has been a landmark case because since then, and it was in 2014, it has been proven, that it has been understood that protecting public morals include ethical concerns about animal welfare, animal being. So that's a very important case. And then later on, there was a very interesting case that lasted 30 years. I know you have to be a geek to like it, about tuna labeling in the US, because basically the US wanted to label their tuna in order to say that dolphins had not been harmed in the process of fishing the tuna, because there is this specific phenomenon in the Eastern tropical Pacific where actually dolphins are swimming above the tuna, and Mexican fishermen were really setting on dolphins to simply fish the tuna. And so it's really specific to that area, and it was mostly Mexican vessels doing this. And so the US wanted to, make sure that this would not get to their market. And so they created, first they banned the product, and they were told they could not do that. So they created a label like Save Dolphins. And in order to get this label, the rules were a bit different, considering where you were fishing. So if you were fishing in that specific area, you had more rules to respect to be able to get this label. For instance, if I remember well, you had to get an observer on board of the vessel to prove that you were not setting on dolphins. And of course, the Mexican fought this very strongly. And in the end, after 30 years of back and forth of the US fine-tuning its measure, it ended up by being approved because the label was said to be even-handed, calibrated to the risk for animals in the different regions. So basically, the US had to agree that if another place in the world would have had the same sort of phenomenon, they would also apply the same criteria. So it had to be fair, not discriminatory for a specific region based on criteria, but it was approved. And what was interesting in this case that it was not about the conservation of the dolphins, because it was really mentioning that technically speaking, it was also about the dolphins getting just harmed and also getting separated from the rest of the group, being stressed by the approach of the vessels. So it was also about their welfare. So that was quite interesting. And just also to tell you, as we spoke about the like products, what was very interesting is that in that case, which is one of the most recent, this question of the likeness of the tuna was never really discussed, because yes, the panel at the time of the dispute looked into likeness, but what they compared was Mexican tuna and US tuna, which was not the question. The question was, is actually tuna fished by setting on dolphin the same as tuna fished without setting on dolphins? And that question was never assessed by the panel, interestingly. And the Mexican, in their own arguments, actually said, we are not happy because we can't get this label and then we don't manage to sell on the US market. This label gives them a competitive advantage. People are not buying our tuna anymore. So actually, as we spoke about it in terms of consumer preferences, that's very intriguing. That means that's not really the same product, right? If they don't buy it. So this is really theoretical. At the moment, there's not been a case to really settle this. But I just wanted to let you know that if at some point you are fighting for higher standards or for a ban on a certain cruel product that you are not producing at home, or even that you are producing at home, and you are told we can't do that because if we do this, we will still import a lot of that, and it's not good for our producers. You can argue that imported goods should also be included in the measure. And if you are told, as you might often be, no, we can't because of the the WTO, you will be able to look at this presentation, or you can reach out to me, and you can argue that, honestly, if it's based on a strong ethical concerns, where you can show that citizens in your country really care about this, you have some arguments. And it's not certain that another country will actually attack you. I think nobody never attacked India on banning foie gras. France could have, never did. When New Zealand stopped exporting live animals, nobody complained either. So that's also interesting. We also have to remember that often there is no dispute and there is no consequences. For instance, the EU has rules related to slaughter that apply to imported meat. So for instance, they have to respect similar rules as the EU rules on the time of killing. Nobody never complained about this. Same for the rules that we have on cats and dog fur. We are banning it. It's never been a case on that. So that's also something to always keep in mind. So if you're faced with that in your advocacy, this shouldn't stop you. You should build your case, because often the person you're talking to doesn't know so much about this. So you could always further your case. I want also to say that potentially there could be also a case soon, we never know, on because, you know, as you might know, in the EU, we are working currently at reviewing our animal welfare legislation to make it more up to date with science, hopefully. So we hope that in this legislation, there will be a clear ban on all cages, for instance. And at the moment, they are considering to have more imports requirements, so more of the rules also applying to imported goods. This might lead some countries to attack the EU at the WTO. This is not a done deal. Maybe it's not going to happen. Maybe it's going to happen. But so maybe at some point in the future, we might have a dispute and we might have a ruling. If at some point the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO works again, I'm not going to get into details, but we could have a ruling on ethical concern and farmed animals. Because at the moment, of course, the case is on seals. So there's a lot of discussion. Could this apply actually to farmed animals? My belief is I don't see why not, in the sense that it's ethical concerns. But of course, it has never been done. Maybe it's going to be done. And I just wanted to raise with you also a case that is a bit in parallel. You might know that the USA, in California, that they adopted also a ban on cages in California, and that this ban on cages was fought within the United States by other states than California, especially the one producing pig meat. They didn't want to apply those rules, and they were exporting meat to California, and so they had to respect the rules, and they didn't want that. So they really fought in court in the US very hard to say that California did not have the right to actually impose such standards on goods that were imported into California. And what's interesting is that the Supreme Court was actually called upon by the industry to, rule on this in the US. And the United States, among those states, it has also rules, in terms of how you can restrict trade between the states in the US. And this is very similar to what the WTO does for all the countries, or what the EU does for within the EU. So interestingly, we were all looking at the Supreme Court case on this cage ban on California, because it was interesting to see what they were going to conclude. And they actually won the case. So California can have its ban on cages. So that's quite interesting to see how these rules about, being allowed to restrict trade in order to respect ethical concerns are applied in different sort of settings. So that was on the international rules, and I hope it was concrete enough so that you can see how you can use it, in your own advocacy. Just to let you know that, in my opinion, in the EU at least, there's never been a stronger case to argue for measure on farmed animals to be applied also on imported goods, because there's such a strong ethical support for this. There was a Eurobarometer, so a pan-European survey in 2016, and like more than 93% of the European citizens that were surveyed wanted to have same rules for imported goods and for other like EU goods on animal welfare. My thinking is that probably many EU citizens have no idea that it's not the case at the moment. So that's one. And also, of course, a lot of EU citizens want to see better rules and wants to see the EU do more to promote greater awareness of animal welfare internationally. And also, if you must know, the EU has this interesting tool, which is called the European Citizen Initiative, where you can collect signatures and make sure that, like, to call on the European Commission to look at the topic. And we have used this a lot as animal protection organization. And the rules are quite harsh to be able to be successful. You need more than 1 million signature in different EU countries with different, so it's quite difficult. And among the 10 initiatives that have been successful throughout the EU, like 6 were related to animals. And most recently, if you might have seen, we have done one in only 10 months. Normally we have a year, and we collected 1.5 million of signature to ban fur farming in the EU. So just to say that there is a strong support of EU citizens on animal welfare issue. Whenever they're asked to talk, to sign up things, they go for it. So maybe in your country it's the same. Maybe all these tools are also available in your countries. And I'd be happy also to discuss with you bilaterally if I can help in any way. I just want to touch upon trade agreements, because it's a bit maybe less useful, I would say, in the Asian context, but still there's a way of doing things about it. Some countries, I know more about the European Union case, but other countries too, like the US, like Brazil, like China, like ASEAN countries, they negotiate trade agreements between each other. And what can be in those trade agreements is also defined by the World Trade Organization. The idea, of course, of the World Trade Organization is to facilitate trade. So, of course, if you want to facilitate further the trade among certain countries, the WTO is very fine with it. So normally, when you have those kind of agreements between certain countries, they have to cover substantially all the trade, which means that in many cases, most of the cases, animal products are going to be covered. So those trade agreements, what they do is that they define how tariffs, the price that you pay to import a product, can be lowered. And so in many cases, they will make it easier to import animal products. And why is that interesting for us? Because those trade agreements, in addition to do this, they also sometimes include chapters on different rules. And so they can have an impact, as I said there, on market access, so how you can easily import certain animal products, but they can also have an impact on your labeling rules, like how restrictive you can be in the labels you're creating. They can also have an impact on how you audit the establishments, the slaughterhouses, for instance, from which you import the meat. But they can also, depending on the countries negotiating, offer opportunities to have clauses provision on cooperation. So, of course, there's a lot of negative, of risk, but there's also opportunities in terms of developing relationship between countries. The problem usually is that those trade agreements aim to facilitate trade without looking at all at what we call methods of production, so animal welfare, for instance. So to give you an example, like if you facilitate the trade in, let's say, in the beef trade, you will say, okay, I'm going to lower the tariff on beef, make it easier for the EU to import beef from certain countries. It doesn't consider usually whether those cattle has been kept on feedlots or not. And the animal welfare consequences are very different, of course. Usually also, if you lower the price of imported goods, it might stimulate the demand for certain products because it's a bit cheaper on the market, importing it. So in the EU, a certain product can become cheaper. Like, let's say importing beef from a certain country can become cheaper. And then you might import more of that and produce less in the EU. And if, for instance, in that country, the standards are lower, then potentially you might consume the same, but produce it in a place where the standards are lower. So maybe more animals are kept in a bad condition rather than the opposite. So that's also problematic. And usually it tends to favor the intensification of the sector. Why? Because often it's the big companies that can face competition at global level. And often those big and verticalized companies, not saying they don't care about animal welfare, but it's a system, it's a system usually more intensified where animals are more used and where there is maybe more means to do better for animals, but there's also less willingness because of the willingness to make cheap products. So those trade agreements can be quite interesting. But of course, not every country is, negotiating similar agreements. I want to take two examples, one that is not Asian, one that is Asian. Like, just to give you an example, the European Union negotiates a lot of trade agreements. As of 20 years ago, roughly, it started to put in those agreements small provisions saying that the countries would cooperate on animal welfare. That is not bad. It's good that that's in there. But at the moment, not much has happened with this cooperation. We are trying, us, like as an organization, to really push for concrete progress targets to be decided for this cooperation, but often nothing happens really. So our key issue is usually that, for instance, in the EU-Mercosur agreement, it's very interesting for us because, Mercosur countries produce a lot of animal products, chicken, beef, and the EU imports a lot from them, really a lot. And a lot is connected to deforestation, for instance. So for us, it's a very important agreement. At the moment, all the tariff reductions that are included have no condition at all, apart from one. So meaning that the EU at least has shown that on one occasion, which is shelled eggs, which is not a product that we import a lot from Mercosur, that they could add an animal welfare condition. So the idea of this condition is that in order for the eggs to benefit from a lower tariff, a lower price to be imported, they have to respect similar rules as in the EU in terms of welfare. So this is a principle, in principle, something we really like at the moment in the absence of something else. We really like this conditionalized liberalization, so these conditions on tariff reduction. But in this case, it's really a small trade, so it's not super useful, but it still has a precedent, very important. And voila, so this agreement creates a lot of issues for us in terms of concerns for deforestation, the kind of trade it's going to foster, the sectors it's going to stimulate. Indeed, it's going to stimulate more pig meat production, also dairy production. So again, always things that we don't see as a very good thing. But I wanted to give you more of an Asian example just to say what can happen, like in Asia.
Sorry,
also.
Steph.
Yeah?
Just before you start, you're just running out of time. Just got a couple minutes left to wrap it up because we've got some great questions for you.
I'm happy to stop, then we can get question. And maybe if the example is nice to illustrate the question, that's fine for me.
Please, yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. Nogan, do you want to take over with the questions?
Yeah, thank you, Elliot and Steph. Let me begin with the first questions from the chat. From Jess. How long does it usually take to get the EU member states to ban imports of low welfare animal products? Or is it more realistic to lobby for enhanced welfare or conservation standards to be applied to the products instead? For example, Jess is interested in civet coffee and wonder if there might be scope to lobby for an import ban, even if it starts as a ban on the import of cage-produced civet coffee or civet coffee made in regions where there are endangered species getting caught up in the trade.
That's very interesting. I remember that from my trip to Indonesia. I guess that I see then what we are meaning. I think it's not easy to get really some lower standard imports to be banned. In general, we don't look at it like, let's just, EU usually doesn't like ban. So for instance, what works better is when you have the opportunity like we have now, because we're revising our rules. It's to get certain standards to be also implemented on imports. And how do you define which ones? The ones that are very concrete, that can be applied by other countries easily, like for instance, no cages, or for instance, density, or for instance, enrichment, very concrete things where there's ethical support, that the citizens really care about them. On civet coffee, if the EU wanted to, they could. They don't produce coffee this way, so they could say, we don't want this method of production. We will just ban it here in Europe. Whatever, nobody could make that like this, and we don't import. But to be honest, in general, countries don't want to do that much because it gets really frontal with the countries where it comes from. So, to be honest, I think it would be difficult to get these banned in the EU. We're also trying to get banned, for instance, kangaroo-derived products. Like for seals, it's a very cruel hunt, but it's difficult, those kind of products. So you might have easier to actually approach corporate, to approach like supermarkets, retailers, and get them to be sensitive to this and not want to import it. Sometimes this is also an avenue to use when you can't get legal standards from a country, I mean.
Thank you, Steph. I will move on to another question for Monique. We'll priority questions on the first come, first serve basis, and also ask one question from each of the participants, and the rest will be sent to you via email. So this question is from Monique. So do you know a source to find global trade rules related to trade of hens or duck eggs that might mention standards for animal welfare of the source hens?
No, there is nothing. So basically, in terms of international rule, the problem is that at international level, the only rules that exist on animal welfare are the WOA, terrestrial guidelines, aquatic guidelines, and those are not mandatory. Those are guidelines. So technically speaking, there is no rules per se, but of course, some rules apply to animals in trade products, the general rules, what we call the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, the GATT. And so that's what would apply. And it applies in general to all products. But on animal welfare, exactly, you won't have anything that you can use. And that's the difficulty. That's why you have to rely on ethical concerns mostly.
Thank you. This is another question from Chi-Yin. And she asks, so we're a honey producer and trader. In our supply chain linkage, we are trying to persuade other beekeeping farmers to produce sustainable honey and persuade farmers limit or avoid using pesticides. However, in Vietnam, there are few research and practice about ethical honey productions. Can you suggest some regulations in this sector?
It would be good, and I could look into that with you to see, but for instance, if there are a lot in exporting honey to the EU, I know in the EU, honey is getting a big topic because, of course, there are a lot of sort of organic producer in the EU and are very annoyed with the blend that they can get from elsewhere in the world. But I think that what Karuna has to look at is more the rules on pesticides in those cases. And the EU is trying to strengthen them and to apply also more of these pesticides related rules to imports. And that could be of interest to you. I'm happy if you get in touch to sort of point you to the process, but it's not been defined yet, but there's a lot of discussion about it at the moment in the EU.
Thank you so much. Another question from Fanny. And so are there plans for WTO to update their trading rules anytime soon? It feels very outdated in many regards. The capitalist free trading world of overconsumptions of the earth resources is no longer sustainable, and we've known this for a bit of time now.
I completely agree with Fanny. I don't think we can expect an update of the rules. It's extremely complicated because all the countries would have to agree. And that's why also nothing is progressing at the moment. Some big countries would want to see agriculture really out of it, which is a discussion since early 2000 at least. And so, no, I don't think we can expect really updates. They're working on the sustainability dimension of it. There are more and more discussion, notably based on what I explained to you about methods of production and how at the moment it's not seen that a method of production that is not visible in the final product, like animal welfare, for instance, you can't see it in the product in the end. At the moment, it's not considered normal to discriminate product, to differentiate them. based on this kind of method of production. But of course, all the debates at the moment are about that kind of things, like emissions, forced labor, animal welfare, all things you can't see in products. So they're discussing about it. At the moment, there's a lot of exceptions, as I mentioned to you, and a lot of time countries are relying on those exceptions. And I think it's going to be difficult to de-exceptionalize the rules. But yeah, there are a lot of discussions. But to be honest with you, don't await too much. More argue on what's existing. I think we have some space to act, but it's true. I agree with you. It's not sustainable. It's created from another world when there was not all these crises that actually means that we have to make sure that the trade, at the moment, the trade aggravates situations. It can lead to more deforestation, to more emissions, to more cruelty to animals. And that is not, in my opinion, something we should allow for. So yeah, it's a bit outdated, but I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for new rules, unfortunately.
Thank you. And another question from Ruli. So he thinks that B2B is still relevant for this work in Indonesia's context. So CP1, the biggest integrator, will export chicken to Belgium. Which member of EU states and will apply the trade policies on animal welfare?
B2B business, yeah, I think it's still relevant because when business in Europe will import, those products, even to transport them, they will have to respect the rules. So for instance, on meat chicken, we hope that certain standards will be applied on imported goods, on density, for instance, potentially, hopefully also on breeds. We are fighting a lot to get slower growing breed in the EU to be mandatory. And so, yes, a business importing those chicken from Indonesia, for instance, would have to make sure that their suppliers are approved in that sense. It wouldn't be at the level of member states. It would be the entire EU. As you know, it's a single market, so a product entering any member state can go everywhere. So normally they have to all apply the same rule, because anything getting in the EU by any member states can go anywhere after that.
I have another question from Jess. Has there been research on the impact on import bans on domestic productions or consumptions? Just wonder if banning an animal products would make it more of a destination tastescape, and so could perhaps increase the demand for the product in producing countries as part of tourism.
Good question. No, usually not, because if I've never done studies about that, but usually as those bans come out, citizens really being shocked by certain method of production, usually doesn't really replace it by the people going to the state countries and having it. But I'm guessing that, yes, for instance, if you ban foie gras in India, for instance, maybe the people who have the means might decide that when they go to France, they'll have foie gras. But I think that it's still worth it overall, like especially if there's a willingness, if the country itself is a bit shocked by the production methods. But no, it would be an interesting thing to study on certain specific bans, but why not? At least for sure, for instance, cages, don't expect, for instance, Europeans to enjoy going to another country to enjoy a caged egg. Nobody would do. In another country, they might not be able to find a free range one, and so maybe would consume caged eggs because they're available and that's all there is. But honestly, on those rules, not about a specific, really weird product, specific product, no, normally it shouldn't change that.
Thank you so much, Steph. And I think that is the end of the Q&A part of this sessions.
I'm so sorry as well of not having seen the time. I had put my thing in big and I really didn't know how long was my presentation. Apologies for everyone. And if you have questions, you can all reach me. You can probably ask for this, my email, and I would take time to discuss with you or my colleagues from the trade team.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steph, for the wonderful presentations and very detailed Q&A. And thank you everybody for asking these very detailed questions as well.
Thanks for your engagement. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, goodbye, Steph.
See you.
And we'll now move to the 5 minutes break before the start of the third session. Welcome back, everyone, to the third session. And I will hand over to Pavitra, our moderator for this sessions, to begin.
Thank you so much, Naukan. I hope you all can hear me well. So hi, everyone. A very good morning, afternoon, or evening to you all, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Pavitra, and I work as a coordinator at the Asia for Animals Coalition, and I'm going to be your moderator for this session on reinforcing the narrative of equality and equity and moving towards a connected justice for animals, people, and the planet. We are thrilled to have three wonderful speakers with us today who will walk us through how we can effectively engage with policymakers and how to make our issues relevant by shifting perceptions and narratives and apply it to drive long-term change. Our first speaker today is Andrea Echeverry, who resides in Colombia. So unfortunately, she cannot be here with us today, but she has been kind enough to pre-record and share her presentation with us. Andrea is an environmentalist and feminist who has dedicated the last 12 years of her life to environmental justice, from the impulse to just relations between people and nature and between human groups. She's been a part of many grassroots movements and civil society organizations, mainly in Colombia and Latin America. She's currently the coordinator of the Global Forest Coalition's Unsustainable Livestock Campaign. Just a quick reminder to all of you that we'll have the Q&A session towards the end of all the presentations. So if you have any questions right now, please feel free to post them in the comment box. We have our team collating the questions for later. Can we please have Andrea's presentation?
Yes, thank you, Pavitra. And I will share the presentation now.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrea Echeverry. I regret not having the possibility to be there with you during this webinar, but it's around 1 a.m. for me, the time that it's going to be live, so it's kind of difficult. Anyway, I'm really glad to be here somehow, and I appreciate the invitation of Asia for Animals for this opportunity, but also especially for arranging this series of webinar, because we need discussions on these topics, these overall topics, to actually tackle the crisis or the multiple crises that we're living in. My name is Andrea Echeverry. I'm part of the GFC staff as Unsustainable Livestock Campaign Coordinator, but I'm also part of the steering committee of the Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign. And today I'm here to share some thoughts, which I call reflections and possibilities for overcoming interrelated crises. So I didn't put them as crises because we have so many that it will be difficult to define the water crisis, the food crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, the social crisis, the economical crisis. I just wanted to highlight some concerns on which we have some data to show how what has been done is not working, because despite a huge number of resources and efforts put into these three topics, figures don't lie, and situation has only worsened in recent years. So the first one is the one that relates to biodiversity loss. The second one is the climate change, or climate crisis. The third one are the social injustices, which it's also a broad topic, but I'll try to focus in bullet points. So regarding biodiversity loss, what is here, it's at least sad. I don't even know how to describe it because it's outrageous. Wildlife population have declined 69% since 1970, and humans who are just, well, less like 1% of life regarding species or biomass, have destroyed 83% of wild mammals. In the right side of the screen, you can see a graphic that I took from The Guardian, on which they explain how much humankind affected other species. And right now, basically all mammals in the world are, whether livestock or humans. 30% of mammals are humans and 60% is livestock. Only 4% right now or mammals are wild mammals, wild animals. And to birds, it's a similar situation because only 30% are wild birds. 70% of birds are chicken or poultry. That means, and when you go through the CBD reports or the FAO reports or others that talk about the biodiversity loss, they usually talk about humankind, but without acknowledging that it's not humankind. It's a way of consumption. It's also a differentiation between the responsibilities of different countries on different companies. So this can be just said that human life has destroyed biodiversity, because we know that communities, that indigenous communities, that local communities, that women can and do relate to biodiversity and even increase rates of biodiversity. So that's one of the things that we need to discuss and to put in the radar to understand one of the many reasons why what has been done for biodiversity just hasn't been working. And also that relates to climate change. Well, I recently came from the international meetings of the UN subsidiary bodies, and it's alarming, it's disturbing what you get to see there, because it feels like the problem is not taken as seriously as it should, as science is telling us. Because remember, last year was published the report, the IPCC report that is called AR6, or it's known as AR6. And what it says, it's something that we already knew, but we didn't know that it was so bad, because the impacts of climate change are wider, are broader, and are faster and more intense than we thought. That's why Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, described it as an atlas, sorry, don't know how to pronounce it, of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. And that's not minor if we understand the role that it has in the UN, but it means that the pathway we have been going through this last 31 years since the UNFCCC was created in '92 hasn't been the right way, because year by year you see how emissions are rising, how climate change impacts are getting worse, and for that you don't even need to see the papers. I mean, there's so much said on climate change that the anecdotic has become scientific and the other way around. But the most disturbing part is that the narrative that we can see during those negotiations is that the UN, the delegations are not trying to reduce emissions. They're trying to maintain us with these false solutions or with this dangerous distraction, such as technophysics, such as the so-called nature-based solutions, which include, but those are not all of them, geoengineering and carbon offsets. And that's something that, regarding narrative, we have to understand that doesn't mean they're actually reducing the emissions. It's a matter of avoidance. So the devil is in the details, and we have to be really careful what's going on and what's been said and what our proposals from organization are, because even if we have nice intentions, it might be easy to not understanding a lot of things that are going on. So it's a good thing that these webinars are happening because we all probably will be learning a lot between all of us and with the knowledge that all of us have. You can see some figures that I took also from the well, those were made by the World Resource Institute, but also based on the report that I mentioned earlier. One last thing that I wanted to say on the matter on climate change is that it's a topic that is not really that has not been a priority during the negotiations. And you can't forget that even if we left all fossil fuels on the ground, only the food system as it goes today will rise temperature globally over 1.5 degrees. And finally, on social injustices, there's a lot that we could say. Especially I'm a sociologist, because I'm a sociologist and I have been studying for a lot of years the nexus, the links between the environmental injustices and the social injustices, which are always worse for women and girls, for indigenous people, for local communities, for small-scale fisher, for small-scale holders. So it's a problem that is not being all addressed together. The social crisis, the economic concentration, the health crises, and all, because it's the same problem as we're going to discuss above. And one of those problems expresses a lot in agriculture. South Asia and Latin America exhibit the highest inequality on land tenure and agriculture, with top 10% landowners capturing up to 75% of the agricultural land. So that's another injustice that emerges from the food system worldwide, which is not even feeding the world, because of the FAO stated last year, as many as 828 million people, it's suffering from hunger. That means the figures are even higher than in preceding years. So we have a food system that's poisoning our rivers, that's making our women sick, that is causing displacements of indigenous people, of traditional communities, and that's not even succeeded on feeding the world. So the UNFCCC acknowledged that there is an interplanetary a planetary crisis, which refers to three interlinked issues. Specifically, they mention climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, but they do not talk about ways to tackle them together, because they say each of these issues has its own causes and effects, and each one has to be resolved separately. So I think that's one of the things that we need to take into account to move forward and to make life possible for humankind and for all living beings in this planet. Because actually what's happening is a different expression of the same crisis, of the same system, which is shaped by capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. But I'm not referring to patriarchy only as the dominance on men over women and over other genders, but it's also a matter of speciesism, of there's a typo there, of androcentrism, which is thinking that the world is for men, not for humankind. And we know that it's mostly for one kind of men, from white men from the north who have shaped this world and who suffer differently from the impacts of what they have done. So addressing the symptoms and not the causes will not solve the different problems in the long term. We need to have an holistic side, an holistic and integrated side that is also responsive to the different territories and contexts. Something that acknowledges the common but differentiated responsibilities in this world crisis, this multiple crisis that we're experiencing right now. And there are a lot of possibilities. Of course, there are the possibilities of grassroots defenders of people on the ground, etc., that are what basically, at least for me, what gives me hope, what makes me think that there's a future for this planet where we can all live together in a just and more equitable way. But there are also some other ways of action that include demanding in a strong way to some of the organizations that are involved somehow in the crisis to make the right decisions, to be wise. And for one of the decision is the thing of the divestment and the investing. So there is an urgent need to divest from the current false solutions, which include monoculture, tree plantation, bioenergy, geoengineering, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, red flash, which we have a lot in Colombia, and it has definitely not worked for its initial purpose. Also, we need to divest from the expansion of industrial livestock. You probably know better than me the impact that it has on deforestation, on zoonotic diseases, on climate, the impact that it has on wildlife, on women. And that's something that I'm not going to further discuss here, because I think we have some resources that we could share, and I will be grateful if you share some information that you think that might be interesting for us. But also we need to redirect, for instance, the climate finance, these fiscal policies to support real solutions in the climate crisis, in particular, gender just and right-based solutions. Also, we need to invest in with active community participation and consent to support small and mid-scale agroecological production systems, also including gender equality. The transformation or overcoming the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis can happen without overcoming the social injustices, without overcoming the gender gap or the discrimination and the difficulties that are facing indigenous people worldwide, that is Global South facing. So we need to find ways to talk to more effectively to some actors that are involved in these investments, to see how we can make some radical changes. And I specifically wanted to concentrate on the divestment thing because the recent launch of two briefings. One that is called Divest Public Climate Finance from False Solution, a roadmap towards gender just and real climate justice, by the Global Forest Coalition. And also there's one of the STRF campaign that was written by Friends of the Earth International, but involved all of the steering committee, where it's also Bank Information Center, Synergia Animal, World Animal Protection, Feedback, International Accountability Project, and Global Forest Coalition. And it explains how the investment in industrial livestock are harming the possibilities of achieving the Paris Agreement goals and also social justice. I have also some numbers and some figures on the investments that the major development banks have done on the expansion of industrial livestock, especially in Africa and Latin America. But there are also some reports for Asia if you're interested in finding out more, and also in becoming part of the campaign. We need us all to be together. We need us all to say to the MDBs to stop financing factory farming, to say the UNFCCC that they should tackle the climate crisis with a gender-based approach, a rights-based approach that moves away from the false solutions, and that also takes into account agriculture for a just transition. We cannot think a just transition without, or phasing out fossil fuels without thinking on a radical change on our food system. It took me a couple of minutes more, but thanks a lot. I wish is a fruitful day for all of you.
That was a very interesting presentation, and Andrea rightly touched upon how a just transition is not possible without ensuring that it encompasses all three facets of food transition and also humans, animals, and the planet, keeping humans, animals, and the planet in mind. For the next presentation, we have Sylvia and Arjun from World Federation for Animals. Sylvia is the communications manager at the World Federation for Animals. She has over 10 years of experience supporting strategic communications and partnership development efforts of different United Nations agencies and programs across Africa, Asia, and Europe. We also have Arjun, who is the chief advisor on strategic policy and public affairs at WFA. Arjun has been active in the animal welfare community for over 10 years, and in his current role, Arjun leads the efforts of a large global alliance of animal welfare and animal protection organizations to establish the relevance and importance of animals and their welfare for sustainable development and environmental protection at the UN. I'm going to pass it over to Arjun and Sylvia now.
Thank you so much, Pavritra. And I want to say thank you, everyone, for making the time to join us today. After such great presentations before us, we really hope we can make this as interesting for you and worth your time. I'm going to share the screen for a presentation that Arjun and I will be sharing with you. I'm just briefly going to. Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen. Otherwise, give me a shout out if not. So thank you so much for inviting us. Before we begin, let me just invite you to reach out to either Arjun or I after a session if you would like to connect. WFA is a global collaboration of more than 50 animal protection NGOs from across the world as of today. And we're organized by NGOs for NGOs to help all of us advocate effectively for global policies that protect animals. You can definitely learn more about our work at wfa.org or send us an email. So from our side, we hope that this session will motivate you to engage in policy process, and hopefully we can engage further in the future. We're going to talk about the purpose of policy change and engaging with governments. Arjun is going to start with a broad conceptual framework on this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a recently published report by WFA calling Unveiling the Nexus, where we're going to illustrate some of the decisions we took in line with this broad conceptual framework. And then Arjun is going to wrap up our presentation with some practical suggestions. So I'm going to invite Arjun to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And so in the sort of presentation today, I wanted to focus very much on the practical experience that we've had in terms of policy engagement and moving the policy process to become more aware of and respondent to the issues of animal welfare that we all sort of work on. So what is the sort of purpose of policy change? I think most of you will understand this and agree. As animal welfare organizations trying to push the issue of animal welfare, animal protection, we, particularly in a policy context, will often find that it's like rolling a boulder up the hill. The issue is not front of mind in most governments, most policymakers, and so it still feels like a niche issue. And so sometimes we need to push really hard to get our issues reflected in policy change. So policy change can help us cement progress into place. So if there is a general sense of progress around animal welfare in a particular country, getting a policy change, getting a law to, for instance, ban caged poultry, then that allows us to perhaps stop pushing for a little bit, put a a brick behind the boulder so the boulder doesn't roll back, and then see how we can move forward from there. Sometimes the policy process actually is very helpful in moving the goalposts, in the sense that legislators, government policy sometimes moves quicker than where the public or producers are in terms of their willingness to change. A good example of that is the global agreement to try and limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. That was not something that was perhaps front of mind of most people, but the policy change, the agreement that became our target, has implications across the spectrum, and therefore is now helpful in trying to move the issues of climate change when it comes to animal production in particular. And third, it's a hook for encouraging the change we want by all stakeholders. Any type of legislation, regulation, policy change that is beneficial to animal welfare can then be used as we engage as organization with producers, with the public, to try and move them to get to the actual change that is needed on the ground. And so the next area I wanted to focus is how to engage with governments. And here we have to understand that for us, animal welfare, animal protection is front of mind. We think about it every day. We work on it every day. It is the thing that drives us. Whereas the people we try to move, particular policymakers, politicians, animal welfare, animals at all, are seldomly front of mind. They don't think about it. It's not part of their day-to-day schedule. It's not the thing that they engage with. And so in trying to move them, we always have to think about what do they need? How can our issue, how can the issue of animal welfare or animal protection be a solution to the problem that they are trying to engage with? And I often visualize it as me standing on one side of the road, a busy road, with my counterparts, the politicians, the policymakers I'm trying to move, standing on the other side. So now I have two choices. I can shout at them and tell them to come over to where I am, because that's where I want them to be. Or I can cross the road myself, take them by the hand and guide them across the busy road to where I want them to be. The second option is always going to be more effective, because we have to engage them. We have to make sure that they understand that the issues that they are concerned about are also the issues that we are concerned about. We just offer animal welfare, animal protection, the things that we care about as a solution to the problem that they are facing. And so, next slide. So the key thing to understand is, what is a government's agenda? What are they trying to achieve? How do they sort of fill their days? What are the issues that they're most concerned about? We as civil society organizations, activists, advocates, we don't set the agenda. We don't determine what governments talk about or think about or prioritize. So we have to start looking at what is their agenda. And so in doing that, here I always use this sort of seesaw visualization, where if you look at the seesaw at the present, it is not where we would like the animal welfare state to be. And so to move the seesaw up, normally the pressure that we apply is what I call in this visualization pressure A. It's the thing that we care about. It's the way we sometimes talk about. Most of the time we focus on the sort of ethical domain. It's the fact that animals are worthy of kindness, and animals are worthy of their welfare being respected. But that doesn't necessarily always work. That pressure that we apply is not necessarily enough to move the seesaw up to where we would like it to be. And so we have to start thinking about other ways to apply pressure, other arguments to use, other perspectives to think about. And so just as an example here, let's think about factory farming. We would like factory farming to end. We think that factory farming is the most egregious form of animal abuse, and if we end factory farming, suffering of animals will end. Simply asking for factory farming to end is often not going to be enough. But if we start thinking about what are the sort of key elements of the factory farming business model, what do they need for that model to be to create a profit, then we know that often what we see is they need certain inputs. They need animal feed, they need antibiotics, they need finance. So if we focus on those issues, we can apply different types of pressures. So what is in the seesaw picture here, pressures B, C, and D, which equally, just as pressure A that we try to apply, will move the seesaw to where we would like it to be. So next slide, please. So how do we make the issue relevant? We always have to think about 3 ways of doing it. First, we have to shift perceptions. For us, animal welfare is important because we care about animals. For policymakers, politicians, they look at animals as commodities. They look at animals as things that can be used. They look at animals as a source of livelihoods for people. Their perception is quite different. Take the issue of climate change. Here, policymakers very much look at animals as producers of greenhouse gas emissions. But there is a way to shift the perception. For instance, if we understand that the Earth has major carbon sinks, major processes, natural processes that capture carbon, the oceans, for instance, or tropical forests. But what people often don't think about is that the ocean can't capture carbon if there's no fish in the sea, because it's the fish that eat the phytoplankton and then drop the carbon on the bottom of the ocean. In forests, it's mammals that act as the main pollinators that allow the forest to regenerate. Without mammals in the forest, there's no regeneration of trees, and then there is no carbon capture. So this is a different way of looking at animals and the role that they play, and therefore the perception that people have will change, and we'll start to think about, okay, now what do we need to do to protect that part? The other is we need to move the narrative. Sometime in a policy debate, it is very, very difficult to raise the issues of animals or animal welfare because it doesn't seem relevant. For instance, if you are having a conversation with your friends and everybody's talking about their experience on their last holiday, and you have this great anecdote you want to talk about because you think it's going to be funny and everybody will enjoy it, and then suddenly, before you have the chance to tell your story, somebody changes the topic of discussion to something that's in the news, and so you still have this great story to tell, but the narrative, the flow of conversation is no longer appropriate for it. And so here, for instance, as an example, when member states were negotiating the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, we wanted to talk about animals and the need to protect animals from disasters as well. But the debate around the Sendai framework was very much centered around how do we save people's lives and how do we protect the critical infrastructure that people need. So in the course of that type of narrative, it is very difficult to make our voice heard. It's very difficult to make people think about animals and their role. And so rather than just pushing the issue of animal protection, we decided to try to shift the overall narratives. And so rather than talking about animals, we started asking questions like, okay, if the focus is to save people's lives, what happens after you save people's lives? It's not enough to save their lives. You also have to save or protect their livelihoods, because people need to be able to continue to prosper after a disaster has hit. Once that was accepted as part of the narrative, okay, yes, as part of our work on disaster risk reduction, we need to talk about saving people's lives and saving their livelihoods. We then move the conversation on to say, okay, what is necessary to protect people's livelihoods? What are the key productive assets that they need? And once that became part of the narrative, we could make the case that animals, for most people, are the key productive asset. And that led to the inclusion of the protection of livestock and working animals as a priority action for member states, for governments to take in terms of their overall strategy on disaster risk reduction. So this is just an example of how we shift the narrative to allow for our message to be heard. And then the final thing to always keep in mind is dollars and cents. Governments, policymakers will always think about, is it affordable? Is it going to be a beneficial return on investment? Is it going to cost? Is the inclusion of animal welfare regulation going to be a burden on our national livestock sector? And so you have to be able to make a business case, for instance. And so here, an example I would like to use is the discussion about rabies. For many, many years, this was an issue that has been going on. People have always been aware of this disease, but didn't find the argument to say, okay, we need to move further on this. So what we found is that working with WHO, FAO, and others, we estimated the annual total costs of rabies, and we all agreed it came to 8.6 billion per year. And then we started looking at what would it take if you start to vaccinate all dogs in all countries. What would be the cost of that? And then we found to do that over a space of 10 years, it would cost 6.4 billion. So suddenly you have this case where if you spend 6.4 billion over 10 years, you eradicate losses annually of 8.6 billion. The business case becomes very, very clear, which then led, of course, organizations like WHO, FAO, WOA, others to come together and think, okay, this is something that we can easily explain. The case is clear. Let's try and find a way to establish a financing mechanism that will allow us to raise that money to focus on dog vaccinations so that we can actually eliminate this disease. Next slide, please.
I think that'll be me.
Yes. So hand over to Sylvia.
Thank you, Darjan. So before I dive in, I just want to give a little bit of a background, a pause in the background, to better kind of get a picture of what I'm going to be talking about. So over a year ago, the UN Environment Assembly achieved what's probably a historic milestone for animal protection movement, because it recognized for the first time in a UN resolution that animal welfare can contribute to addressing environmental challenges, and that animal welfare can contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Apart from this very important language, they also tasked the UN Environment Programme to put together a report that would explore these interconnections between animal welfare, environment, and sustainable development. We believe that this report, this upcoming report, will hold great importance for animal protection organizations worldwide, because it's going to give us arguments that will have been endorsed by the UN that will serve as very powerful material to support our advocacy efforts with governments. We'll be able to use this report to urge policymakers to implement policies that address climate change, that tackle biodiversity loss and pollution while improving animal welfare. It'll give us evidence that enhancing the lives of animals goes hand in hand with ensuring food security, promoting global health, and securing livelihoods. So needless to say, this is a report that the movement is very keen on seeing coming through as a credible and timely report. So to facilitate this process and commemorate as well the resolution's anniversary, we at WFA and our members released a report entitled Unveiling the Nexus, and the image is the cover image of the report. We wanted, and our objective was, to encourage dialogue between policymakers and UN officials regarding these interconnected issues. So with that objective in mind, I'm going to share with you some of the decisions we made during the creation of the report that also speak to some of the guidance that Arjun just shared with us. So a particular decision that we took and that I want to highlight first is how we aim to link animal welfare to their issue of concern, meaning UN officials and policymakers. So at a high level, we identified sustainable development as the matter policymakers are concerned with, and thus try to illustrate how good animal welfare was an opportunity to deliver on this agenda, or vice versa, how the absence of animal welfare may threaten it. So on the one hand, we use diagrams like this that I'm showing you for each chapter that we had on the report. And we tried with these diagrams to visualize how, for example, the systems that suppress animal welfare are contributing to, in this case, biodiversity loss, and ultimately threaten sustainable development. On the other hand, we, for each chapter, consistently structure our arguments around two key aspects. First, we explain why each topic matters for sustainable development. For example, in this case, I'm just highlighting a passage where we noted on arguments on how biodiversity loss will undermine the delivery of 80% of the targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we proceeded to consistently emphasize in each chapter why animal welfare is relevant to the issue at hand, both negatively and positively. So here I'm just highlighting, for example, how, according to IPBES, the overexploitation of animals is one of the, if not the main driver of the biodiversity loss trends that we're seeing today in the 2020 report. So it was always important for us to link it to their issues of their concern. Not only negatively, but also positively within the chapters, we aim to identify issues of their concern that weren't as macro as sustainable development, for example, job creation. And doing this was very important for us because, as Arjun mentioned earlier, presenting animal welfare as an opportunity to address something that was pressing and concrete of a problem on others' agenda, our audience, is a way of effectively fostering collaboration. And this is a tactic that is used by many successful advocacy organizations. Recently, I attended a talk by Human Rights Watch, for example, where they were discussing their strategy to engage with a particular government to help the country move away from prosecuting the opposition. And a key message that was passed on in their interaction with the finance minister is the link between foreign investment and the democratic rule of law. Political oppression is a threat to a thriving economy. And so they're linking effectively their concerns to the concerns of, in this case, the finance minister, in the case of an authoritarian government, to advance human rights. So I just, it came up in a talk and I thought it was a good example of how this is applied in other sectors as well by other organizations. Second, we strive to find reports or statements from different UN organizations named in the resolution that would support our report. So here I'm just showing you an example where we quoted FAO, But effectively in all chapters, we aim to find quotes or statements from the organizations that were named in the UN resolution. And for example, UNEP themselves. Using their language as our arguments was a way of showing them that they themselves agree with us. Another decision that we took was to make sure all our arguments were either backed up by UN reports, as I was mentioning, or scientific studies. We really tried to not have any statements that could be read as emotionally driven. We fact-checked and provided recognizable and credible sources for basically, if not all, the statements in the report. And this, I think, this we believe actually would help our product to be taken seriously by UNEP. When we gave UNEP the heads up that our report was coming, their initial answer was, quote unquote, "Thanks, we welcome inputs, particularly peer-reviewed science." And so I do think that the fact that our report was signposting many scientific studies may have contributed to their decision after our release of the report to share our report themselves with their major groups and stakeholders. That includes representatives from farmers, indigenous people, business and industry, and other civil society organizations representing dozens of groups. So yeah, this is, I think, the third point that I wanted to highlight. The fourth point, and this is going back to Arjun's points of dollars and cents, is we really aim to convey the economic impact when evidence was available. Economic impact of either not considering or economic impact of improving animal welfare. So for example, here we help policymakers better assess the cost of not taking action in curtailing wildlife trade. Policymakers are concerned with economic matters, and framing arguments in monetary terms will help tap into existing political debates, but also increase the visibility and relevance of our advocacy efforts. Along the same line, we also aim to be solution-oriented. So each chapter was wrapped up in policy takeaways, highlighting action-oriented conclusions that could bring about change for animals. And then there are also some other points I want to highlight here that came through when we were putting the report together. On a similar note of being solution-oriented, we decided to use images that would allude to animals' interconnectedness with their environment. Whether it was pictures of animals in their natural habitats or that would reflect welfare, we wanted these images to convey the same attitude of being solution-oriented rather than solely focusing on problems. There are other type of campaigns, such as public mobilizations, where photos of animals in confinement, in close confinement, animal suffering may be more effective. For this particular case scenario, we wanted to use images that would be in line with our text. Another type of imagery that would have worked would be one where the relationship between animals and people is highlighted. Photos like that could have communicated the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: environmental, social, and economic. But yeah, the choice of imagery is definitely an important part of the process for us in sharing a message with policymakers. Seventh, and then I'll have another point and I'll hand back to Arjun, is we aimed, and this is not revolutionary, this is something commonly done, but it was important for us that we provide a common starting point with key definitions, including what we understand for animal welfare, what we understand for One Health, what we understand for Nexus, and what we understand for sustainable development. I should rephrase it, not what we understand, what should be understood in the context of this report, using official definitions with evidence to scientific studies. And then lastly, something that is also commonly done by flagship reports, but I would like to mention it here because this is also something that we did, is to improve accessibility for policymakers with summary and graphics throughout the report. We also had an overview for policymakers, understanding that our audience has different rhythms of communication and may not have the time to go through the full report, we try to ensure that the key messages and policy takeaways were in this 2-pager summary with a graph that would ensure that our message is not lost in their busy schedules. So yeah, I mean, I would love to, there are many other decisions that we took, but for time limitations, I'm gonna leave it there. Of course, if you have seen the report and have feedback, would like to use it, or if you haven't seen it, I will certainly share the link if you want to, but I'm gonna leave it there and then invite Arjun back to share some more overall solutions, suggestions.
Thank you, Sylvia. And yes, I would agree that the Unveiling the Nexus report very much tried to inhabit many of the sort of lessons that we've learned. I just want to finish with some practical suggestions going further on what I talked about before. First is the technical and political side of the issue. If we think about policymakers, politicians, they usually look at an issue through 3 lenses. One is the evidence-based, the scientific knowledge that is out there. The second is the policy lens. It is what is achievable. Will it produce an outcome? How high is it on my list of priorities? So these are the sort of policy considerations that they make. And then finally, it's the political lens. Most politicians will have made certain promises to get elected. And so they have to take those things into account as well. And so what we often find, if you consider both sides, or all 3 sides, but particularly sort of the technical and the political side of the issue, and try to move the argument along both sides of the equation at the same time, you're more likely to be effective in producing the kind of policy change that you would like to see. One is understand that the people we engage with are just like us. Sometimes it can seem quite intimidating to talk to a politician or a senior official in government or an ambassador. But I think in my experience anyway, it's very important to understand that they are just like us. They are just people like us. They want to engage with people. They want to help. They want to be helped. Sometimes you can make a connection on something that has nothing to do with the issue you talk about, but creating that personal connection, just presenting yourself as a human being is often enough to start a real conversation. And sometimes you can use that very effectively. The quick example here, the Sustainable Development Goals, they were developed in 2015 in the political declaration, now has a line that we envisage a world in which humans live in harmony with nature, where all wildlife and other living species are protected. The original language just talked about wildlife and didn't have the phrase other living species in it. We had tried to argue or try to move the UN to reflect all animals, but that argument was rejected. And so at the very last moment, one of the ambassadors that we had been engaging with, I knew that he was a very devout Catholic. And so I showed him the text of a major speech that was given by the Pope, in which he talked about all living species. And so based on that, I suggested maybe you can add that to the text, wildlife and other living species. And because he associated himself with the Pope and the text of the Pope, he was willing to put that forward. And then that language was suggested, and now it's language that we can use to remind governments that this is something that they've committed to. And so sometimes, as I said, the human interaction can be very important. The other part is for policymakers to be willing to listen it's often good that they recognize you, either the organization, yourself. So be present, be visible in the policy space, participate as much as you can. The more you are seen as a partner in the process, the more likely policymakers are going to be willing to listen to you. And finally, I think this is important as well, apply an insider approach. Try always to look at it from a positive perspective. Try to look at policymakers, even if they don't do the thing that we would want them to do, even if they take decisions that we believe are the wrong decisions or based on the wrong arguments. Always look at them as partners. Criticizing them doesn't often help in terms of building a rapport with them and being able to be in the room to be able to deliver your argument. So an insider approach is always going to be preferable than an outsider approach, standing on the outside and telling everybody that they're wrong and we are right. Sometimes being right is not enough. It is getting your point across, and persuading is the name of the game here. So many more suggestions I can give you, but because of the time, I'll leave it there. Very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arjun. Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was a very insightful presentation, and I think all the practical suggestions that you've made were so easy to understand, and I know how difficult it can be to present something like that, because policy always scares like a lot of people, and you have made the suggestions in a way that it can be implemented by many organizations, even new organizations working in the policy advocacy space. So we do have some questions for you, and I'd like to pose the first question to you, Arjun. Have you come across any like some individual policymakers who are in favor of advancing animal welfare? And if so, is it possible or wise for advocates to try and cultivate champions for animals if such people are working in their country?
Yes, I tend to work at the UN level, either in New York or Geneva or Nairobi. My experience is that the vast majority of people we engage with, once you have a conversation with them, you'll find that personally they're quite interested. Personally, they can be quite easily persuadable that protecting animals, advancing their welfare in policy processes is beneficial for animals themselves. The key is always to give them the right argument that they can use vis-a-vis their constituencies, which is their governments, and through their government back to the public. What is the argument they can use to say, we're doing this because we have already agreed to pursue a particular policy objective, and this is a helpful step in that process. But as I said, quite often at a personal level, they're there. They just need to be helped in understanding that what we are talking about is not a threat, but it is an aid. It is just part of the solution. Sometimes, as I said, you have to give them a way to shift their perception, give them a way to look at it in a different way. I always look, for example, for instance, in the debate around rabies. Before we started talking about it, a group of 100 dogs, one of them is rabbits, all 100 dogs suddenly become a threat. But in that same group of 100 dogs, if 99% of them are vaccinated, then 99% of the group of dogs suddenly is a protective shield to people. So it's that way of shifting the perception. Animals as a vector for good is sometimes very important.
Thank you, Arjun. Okay, so the next question is for Sylvia. Do your suggestions on the communication styles and points mainly focus on advocacy with representatives at an international fora, or are there more or different techniques that you would need to be considered when advocating at a more national level? Of course, we're also conscious that advocates would presumably want to incorporate thinking about local culture as shared in the previous session of the event.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question rightly states that the examples that I gave apply to particular context, which is with UN officials and delegates from UN member states. I would say that many of those points about linking your issues to others' concerned apply at the national and regional level. I think it was in the first session we heard about at the personal level how the work with farmers in talking about their kids and their future and connecting, as Arjun said, we're all very similar. We all have similar concerns. So how can we connect to find synergies or areas to advance our agendas? So I think many of those issues are applicable as well at the national level. Being solution oriented is also something very, very applicable. I think that this does not disregard the importance of reminding everyone about the crazy numbers that we're seeing out there. We heard Andrea reminding us, and we all work on the animal protection movement, and yet it impacts us. It just gives us this momentum. So I'm not saying that using, for example, images of animals in what their actual conditions are is not a suitable strategy. I think it's very much case by case basis in terms of what the actual process is. I sometimes fear that we at the policy level, we are kind of moving away too much from those images, for example, and then the work of reminding people why we're doing it may be abandoned. So I think it's a balance. I apologize that my answer is not like a yes or no. But just to summarize, I think many of those issues are applicable. But it's really, I think, at the end of the day about knowing your audience. And so in our case, understanding what the UN officials were concerned for this particular process, understanding what the UN delegates need, which is quick information, quick solutions, quick suggestions on how to move forward. This perhaps would be a different product for a different process. But yeah, perhaps knowing your audience, but I think I'm preaching to the choir because you all do this job better than I do in terms of knowing your audience and tailoring the message to them.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think you've answered the question perfectly. So the next question we have is from Jackson, who asks, can engaging at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific level be helpful to the high-level political forum?
The short answer is absolutely. Yes. I think in affecting policy change, we always have to remind ourselves that to go from point A to point Z, we don't jump immediately. We go through B, C, D, E, and X. And so to always think of it as a journey rather than a revolution, perhaps. And so sensitizing our audience to new kinds of messages, new words, is always going to be very important. So engaging at the SCAP level, having a clear message in terms of what I talked about, the perception, the narrative, the dollars and cents, as well as the clear sort of ask, what kind of language do you want to see? If you do that at the regional level, and if you do that at all regional levels, and the language comes through across different regions and is repeated, sometimes repetition is enough as a way to get people to understand. If people hear the same phrase over and over again, eventually they'll start to repeat it themselves. There's some very good examples of where we use that. For instance, the work on the Committee on World Food Security, where we went at all of the regional consultations with the very same language proposal, which then eventually led to the Committee on World Food Security to adopt that language and clarify in what was then called the Principles for Responsible Investment in Agriculture and Food Systems that animal welfare is an essential requirement for sustainably enhancing productivity and protecting food quality and food safety. So these kind of languages came through the various regional consultations, and because the similar language was presented from each regional consultation at the final plenary session, it became almost unavoidable that that language then became part of the final product. And so engaging at SCAP level is always going to be helpful for HLPF, but for all other purposes as well, whether or not it's discussions in UNFCCC or CBD, it is about slow sensitization of the people that we hope will forward our message in the global national policy debate.
Thanks, Arjun. We do have a few more questions, but I think we're out of time. So thank you so much to both of you for perfectly capturing the essence of today's topic. And we also have, we will be sending out the questions to you if possible. If you have the time, then you can respond to it and we can share it with our participants. Just a reminder that we also have more webinars tomorrow at the same time, so please do join in, and I'm going to hand it back to you, Nokan.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pavitra, Aryan, and Sylvia for the wonderful presentations. And thank you everyone for attending our event. I would like to conclude today's sessions with a brief introductions of upcoming events. So after this event, we will send a feedback form to you, and you are always welcome to share any ideas on how we can improve the quality of our events and also suggest new ideas for future sessions. And we have 3 sessions coming up tomorrow as well at the same time, with the first covering political landscape in animal welfare policies in Asia and the world. The second will cover advocating for policy changes, our definitions and what we have in our arsenal. And the last one will be about implications from international financial institution investment from an Asian context. And in August, we'll also have 2 other sessions lined up for the second installment of this policy event. And as many of you know, in October, we have 2 major physical events, both in Malaysia, the Asia Farm Animal Days, and also our AfA Sarawak conference. Registrations information can be found on our website. So if you have any queries about today's event, please let me know via email, policy@asiaforanimals.com. I will send that over in the chat box in a moment. And thank you once more for participating in our event, and see you tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, and I will conclude today's sessions now. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
See you. Thank you.